You're looking good, and it feels good to be with you today. Hello, I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter, author of this book, Consider My Servant Job. Where do I put this? And this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and just bring your own refreshments. Organic tofu. You just mix it in with other stuff and get that plant-based protein, healthy and beats eating insects like apparently some people are telling us that we're going to have to eat in the future. Oops. Do a little reps up there for room. Okay. First of all, welcome a new follower, Nikki Clements. Hi, Nikki. Welcome. And thanks for the follow. It helps boost the algorithm, and I hope you're being blessed by some of the things I'm talking about today. So, in the news, what's your conference strategy? Think about this. Try one talk in 1 week. Just focus on one talk once a week and see how far you go. Another thing to think about is focus on 3 talks and spread it over 6 months. How does that work? Instead of just being overwhelmed and blown away, or maybe doing something that you're already got a handle on. Sometimes you hear a talk like, yeah, I'm going to the temple, so I really don't need to go to the temple 6 times a week. That's overkill. But focus on just one small thing and work on that one instead of trying to do everything all at once. We still have some of these pro-Hamas protests. Just remember what the Book of Mormon teaches about anti-Semitism, how the Jews are not cast away. And also read section 132 where it talks about Abraham's other children, not just Sarah, not just Hagar, but also Keturah, his third wife. So today's lesson, today's theme is the shattered idealist. We're going to talk a little bit about Zeniff. So when you read this, chapters 7 and 8 are narrative. Chapters 9 and 10 are first-person Zeniff's records. And as we're doing this gets to a bit of a complex section where you have these colonies and offshoots. So you have, starts out in Nephi-Lehi, they go to Zarahemla. Zarahemla, they go back to Nephi-Lehi. You get a little offshoot with at the waters of Mormon, then later with the place of Helam with Alma the elder. Now, it's interesting that Helam, the Book of Mormon says that the tradition was they'd named the lands after the people who found it or discovered it. So Alma, chapter 8, verse 7. So Helam was the person who discovered this. So this wasn't new land. They're actually going to areas that had been previously settled or previously occupied, and we don't know exactly what's going on there, but there was previous areas. Another one is, then you also have the land of Shemlon, and the priest of Noah go there, and also Desolation, where the Jaredites go. So this gets a little bit chaotic. When I was in the Missionary Trading Center, President Boyd K. Packer suggested you sit there and get a piece of scrap paper and you draw a map on it. It's sort of a triangular map, just to keep track of where people are going and what's going on and how things come back. And he did it, and apparently the narrative held up. This wasn't Joseph Smith doing it. There weren't any continuity errors. Another thing to think about this is colonies. This is interesting. This is an established fact in history that when you have colonies, you get some wild things happen when you have a colony. For example, in ancient Greece, you had the motherland in Greece, but they sent colonies over to what we now call Turkey, or the scholastic term is Asia Minor. And so out of that migration from Greece to Asia Minor, you had Homer, the poet, Iliad and the Odyssey. You had Thales, who was the first scientist. You had Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, and Diogenes, all who were philosophers that predated Socrates and Aristotle. These were what we call natural scientists, not so much philosophers. Also, keep in mind with Greece and Turkey is that Turkey is where Paul did a lot of his ministry, and many of his epistles were addressed to Grecian saints in Turkey or in Asia Minor. Another example of the colonization factor is the United States of America. We're a colony, 13 colonies off of the United Kingdom. Look at the things that happened in America. This isn't to degrade other countries, but where do Nobel Prize winners come from? Look that up. And the principle is it's a fresh start, a clean slate principle. So when you get these colonies, offshoot of Zarahemla, you get a fresh start and see how talent develop, as did with Greece and also in America. You think about George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. If they were back in England, do you think they would have risen to the fame that they would have, as opposed to being born here in America? Another thing to think about is BYU-Pathway, the online school. BYU has always had an issue. We want to get BYU, the BYU experience, to as many people as possible, and you just can't do it with one campus. So we created a second campus in Hawaii, then a third campus in BYU, Idaho. And it's interesting, out of BYU, Idaho, that's where BYU-Pathway comes from, not from the mother colony or BYU-Provo, but from a colony. You got a fresh start with BYU, Idaho, and we're able to do something incredible for the church, something we've been trying to do for decades. So, the 4 chapters we studied today. Mosiah chapter 7, that's the comedy of errors. So in Omni, verse 27, it talks about people who want to go back to the original lands, the original homelands. Hey, we have disputes about homelands. Sound familiar? Part of this may come from Leviticus chapter 25, is that after 50 years, what happens if people sold off lands in ancient Israel, after 50 years during the Jubilee years, the lands would revert back to the original tribal holdings that Moses and Joshua established. And so you have that, maybe a principle, and some sense of patriotism too. It talks about teasings. That's the principle of the squeaky wheel principle. That people are just curious, okay, what happened to these people? We had family members who went there, and they went there, they came back, they went out again, we haven't heard from them. So the leader of this expedition was a man named Ammon. It's interesting, he wasn't a Nephite, he was a Mulekite, so I'm not sure what the connection was. He was a descendant of Zarahemla, who was the king. The land and the king have the same name. So he was a Mulekite royalty or a Mulekite elite, but he led this expedition, even though he didn't have any historical connection to it. So they travel with the group, they get lost, and then they run into King Limhi, who's the grandson of Zeniff, and they're outside the city walls, and Limhi thinks that they're the priests of Noah, so they capture them, take them in, and then they are able to sort things out. And what they do is they talk about the problem is that the Zeniffites are under bondage to the Lamanites, and it's a 50% tribute. Now, go to these tax sites to see how much we pay in taxes. There's something called Tax Freedom Day, and that's a certain day of the year where you stop paying the government and you start keeping your money. So you have that problem. You have the other issues. The Zeniffites sent out once they were put in bondage, they tried to send a group out to go back to Zarahemla. They got lost. Now think about this. What's about the geography that caused so many people to get lost? What's about the Book of Mormon geography that causes people to get lost? That tells you a little bit of a clue. But they didn't go to Zarahemla. They went to the land of Desolation, or the Jaredite lands. They found the place covered with bones, found some of the swords, and there's a little bit of archaeological evidence with the swords I'm not going to get into. And they also found the 24 plates. So was this 24 individual slices of plates, or was this 24 books? It might have been 24 books. That'd make a little bit more sense for a complete record. So they take those, they manage to go back to the Zeniffite colony, and they have the third issue is that you had a prophet that was killed. And pay attention to the doctrine that Abinadi teaches about the incarnation. We'll talk about that in our next lesson. God becoming a man and atoning. And then at the end of chapter 7, they start citing missing scripture. These things that they're quoting, they're not in the Bible. So as this meeting is that Limhi and Ammon, they have the people together, and so they're comparing notes. So Limhi fills them in Mosiah chapter 8. What happens is Ammon fills them in on King Benjamin and what happened, so everyone's on the same page. It's interesting. They're at Mosiah 7, chapter 7, verse 17, is they're at the temple. This may have been the temple that Nephite built. Interesting, good. They got something good with the continuity again. Once again, they bring up the issue when Limhi is talking with Ammon. He mentions the 24 plates, and they ask about, do you have anyone who can translate? And What Ammon says something interesting. Pay attention. We don't read the American Revolution. Don't read America into the Book of Mormon. He says that, yeah, we have a person who can translate because our King Mosiah II, he's a seer, and with part of the gift of seership, he can translate. So in America, we don't give our political leaders religious powers, and that's ingrained in the Constitution. Now, they meet with religious leaders. When we swear in a president, it's the Chief Justice, not the Pope, not an Archbishop. They do use a Bible, but that's not mandatory. That's just a bit of a tradition we have. And then you contrast that if you're watching the coronation of King Charles III, how he received a charge. Now, of course, this is run by the Anglican Church because that's one of the titles of the King of England, is that he's Defender of the Faith. That's a funny title because that was actually a title the Pope gave the king, but now they have another religion, but they just kept the title. It sounds cool or whatever it was. But King Charles III got it. They were diverse. They had a rabbi and they had an Eastern Orthodox person giving the king a charge, and so they're playing it nice and being inclusive. Then later on, King Charles III, they put up a screen and they anointed King Charles III prior to being a king. So he got a charge from religious leaders, and he was the king was anointed before becoming king. And kings have religious aspects to them. We'll talk a little bit about in the next lesson with King Noah and the priest. So they talk about also read 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10, where it talks about King Saul, David, and Solomon. They were also seers, and King Solomon dedicates the temple. It wasn't the priest or the prophet. It was the king who had these religious functions. So we talk about this division about a prophet, seer, and a revelator. And this is the only place in the Book of Mormon where they talk about it. Then it comes up in the Doctrine and Covenants as titles to that Joseph Smith had. So a prophet, now prophecy, that's a gift of the Spirit. That's not an office in the priesthood. A prophet's a witness of Christ, Revelation 19:10. A prophet is a teacher. A prophet's also a foreteller. I know in CES circles, they say, well, a prophet's a forth teller. You go back to read Revelation or Isaiah or Ezekiel and tell me that that's not prophesying about the future. It's straight up prophesying about the future. Prophecy is a gift of the Spirit. Have you thought about this, praying about to know the future about your life, in addition to a patriarchal blessing? When you're a bishop interviewing a person, to have the gift of prophecy about, okay, where's this person going in their life? What do I need to know about their future state? And what warnings do you need to give them? Think about that. The gift of prophecy is for everyone. Then you have the title of seer. Now, seer is greater than a prophet and a revelator, but we put it in the middle. So is that a chiasmus? But a seer can, the interesting thing about a seer is a seer can see things that are past and can discover hidden things. And then the revelation is just uncovering something, uncovering a hidden thing. So we have this quote from John A. Widsoe, which is sort of the standard. A prophet is a teacher of known truth. A seer is a perceiver of hidden truth. A revelator is a bearer of new truth. In the widest sense, the one most commonly used, the title of prophet includes other titles and makes of the prophet a teacher, perceiver, and bearer of truth. And then you have the aspect of translation, which is more to the point of what's going on. So it hits that wall, and they can't go any further with that point. So Mosiah chapter 9 is where we get the first-person record of Zeniff. And this is the shattered idealism. Now this is interesting. He's on both the expeditions to Lehi-Nephi. Is that Zeniff was a spy, and he saw that there's a lot of good with the Nephites, and he went back and talked about that, but the leader of the group was bloodthirsty, and there was this big contention, and they went back, and then they came back for a second expedition. And it's interesting because you have the starry-eyed idealist, and you have the bloodthirsty leader, and so these are two different directions. It's a bit like politics now. We kind of lean extreme directions. We don't have a center ground that's more stable. Then Zeniff, as he's recording this, he makes the point that he's overzealous. Now we have two talks about zeal. The first one is BYU President Cecil Samuelson, September 7th, 2010. He talked about appropriate zeal. It's interesting because he's given this to college students about the zeal that college students have, and think of that in terms of the pro-Hamas protests going on. And the other one was a talk by Hugh W. Nibley called Zeal Without Knowledge. And so I put a link to that one in here. And it's interesting to think about where zeal takes us. We talk about being active members, but in the Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about being a lively member. And of course, we don't want to be robots and bench warmers in church, but there's a problem being a zealous. You can cause problems that go in the wrong direction. It's like sometimes you see this with missionaries. I have a friend of mine, she's left the church, and she talked about she'd just be so super perfect with studying her scriptures, and she served a mission and graduated from BYU. And she'd come in, her mom would see her that she'd fell asleep over her scriptures, and I'd say, "Oh, I have such a lovely daughter." And no, this is a bit of an inappropriate zeal, taking things a little bit too far, focusing on behaviors. So, to use a term I think has been attributed to Vladimir Lenin, Zeniff was what we call a useful idiot, a tragic idealist, a useful idiot. So what the king does is he takes some lands that were already occupied and clears the people out, and then he says, "Okay, here you can take care of this land." And what happens is eventually they start tributing them. The Zeniffites are very industrious, so they start taxing them. Then there's some skirmishes involved. But Zeniff goes from just, these are wonderful people, there's good in them, and he's having to forge swords to kill these people that he loves so much. And he keeps talking about that he's overzealous. To his credit, he did learn, but being overzealous, that's a character flaw. Mosiah 10 is one of these interesting chapters, and you're glad it's in there. It talks a little bit about the Lamanite culture. So, is there bias in the Book of Mormon? Are we reading slanted history? Joseph Fielding Smith said this. This is from Doctrines of Salvation, chapter 2, starting on page 202. And he said, you pick up a record of the history of the church, and that record is accurate. It fell to my lot to prepare a volume of history. This is Essentials in Church History. And because I did not regard as true what our enemies have said, I've gone in for a little criticism myself. You may as well say that the Book of Mormon is not true because it does not give credence to the story the Lamanites told of the Nephites. Now, that's an interesting, a bigger debate about can you be unbiased, or what's a tolerable threshold of bias? When you go to a Holocaust museum, do they sell copies of Mein Kampf? Well, that is the Lamanite version of history, is what President Joseph Fielding Smith talked about. So Richard L. Bushman, you can find this in this book called By Study and Also by Faith, Volume 2, and it starts on page 52, and it's called The Lamanite View of the Book of Mormon History. And so he takes that challenge up, says, okay, how do the Lamanites see things? Or what would the Lamanites' version be? Well, that's interesting, but let's go back to what the Book of Mormon has to say. Is that, according to Zeniff, is that the Lamanite version of history involves two words, wronged and wroth. They believe that they're wronged by their brethren, that they're driven out of Jerusalem, that they're wronged in the wilderness, they're wronged in the sea, and they're wronged by not having in the land of their first inheritance. They didn't inherit the leadership thing. Laman was the eldest son, so by primogeniture he should have been the king, but is always Nephite. Wrath, and that's an issue that keeps cropping up in the Book of Mormon, Alma 54:24, about who's the king, and that the Nephites have this record with their version of history, and the Lamanites want to destroy these records so that the Lamanites control the narrative. Classic 1984. He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. So they're wronged, then they're wroth. That is, wrath is wrath or anger. They're angry or wroth because they do not the dealings of the Lord, and they're wroth because Nephi usurped the leadership and he took the records. And the Lamanites were taught to hate and plunder. Now, this is kind of interesting. That is a good recipe for culture of failure. We were wronged and we're angry about it. Now, when you listen to people talk, is that their mental frame? Are they angry because they had some injustices to them? Now think about this. Look at the way the church was treated in this dispensation and how it was treated by the United States of America. And you read these early the journals from early brethren about what happened being put in prison for their religious beliefs. Now you look at the church, it never took this approach. Now we talk about being wronged, but we weren't wroth. We didn't get angry with things. When Brigham Young comes out here, he flies the Stars and Stripes, and he applies for statehood. So he said, yeah, we have these grievances, and we petition Congress, and we use the legal processes, but we're not angry. America is still a good country, and we can work with it. It's what the Book of Mormon talks about. So think about that too, is your political ideology or your personal ideology. Are you wronged? Are you wroth? And is that poisoning you? Focusing on anger and past grievances. And this contrasts with the Zeniffite culture of being industrious. And think about the ideals of the title of liberty. What culture is driving the Lamanites? What culture is driving the Zeniffites? And this is interesting. That's where this first, the primary source records end. We get 2 chapters about Zeniff talking about things. So he starts out being this idealist, and then he ends up having to forge swords to kill the people that he once idolized. What are your feelings about that when you think about that on a human level? A person who loses their idealism when they have to face reality. Are there certain incorrect things that you need to drop in order to face reality? Some of your idealism that are just plain wrong or incomplete. So that's a reading assignment. Let's go to the Christ quotient, and we're at 21 minutes. So if the Book of Mormon is true, then the doctrine of Christ it contains is also true. That's just a Venn diagram. So as you read this section, helps bolster what we call the complexity argument for the Book of Mormon's truthfulness. Is that the Book of Mormon is a very complex book. It's not a simple narrative. And this is a complex area that we're reading. So have you ever written a book that's complex, and then within these parameters, the translation parameters that Joseph Smith had, Isaac Asimov in his 60s, he was able to write a short story in an hour. So that's a person at the top of his game. My first article I ever sold to the Ensign is called Keeping the Sabbath and Keeping My Job. That was a first draft. I sit there, and as I was walking home from work, got a little piece of paper with a Sharpie marker, jotted down an outline, put it in my pocket, came home, sat down on my computer, typed in the first draft, proofread it, sent it off to the church, and it was published just with the first draft. Some people can write that way. Robert Heinlein, Mozart, of course. But with a long book like the Book of Mormon, that's not how the Book of Mormon was written. It's just too long and too complex to just be struck off that way, where Joseph Smith isn't going back and rereading the manuscript or going there with continuity notes and having to double check things. It's just coming out and done in one draft, and it's a very long book. So think about that as you're reading. Could Joseph Smith done that? Someone who could not dictate a coherent letter, as his wife said. And here's another thing to think about: the culture of death and the culture of life. Talked a little bit about this. Let me just recap. Let me just recap some things about the culture of being wronged and the culture of wrath, victimhood, and anger. Using your hurt feelings to manipulate people. Hey, we were treated badly, so let's do a shakedown. Now contrast that with the culture of Christ. I didn't say the American culture, because that keeps changing from decade to decade, and we have no quite agreement about it. I mean, there's certain principles that make America work, but we're not here to preach Americanism. We're here to preach the doctrine of Christ. So think celestial. What's celestial thinking? What's the culture of Christ? In 1998, Elder Richard Scott gave a talk called Removing Barriers to Happiness, where he talked about these clashes between church doctrine and local cultures. In fact, a while ago, Elder D. Ref Uchtdorf had to go to Africa and had to tell the African saints that, the cultural tradition of dowry there, I can't remember the local term for it, but it's a type of dowry. Yeah, this is incompatible with the gospel, so stop practicing it. And so that creates some issues where you have members of the church, the ladies, who don't have a dowry because it's incompatible with the doctrine of Christ. Okay, how do they get married? We're really having to break the culture on that, and word of wisdom issues too. Closer to our time, William K. Jackson, October 2020, gave a talk specifically called The Culture of Christ. And then April 1971, one of my professors at BYU, Arturo de Hoyos, gave a talk called The Universality of the Gospel, where he talked about this, about the culture of Christ, making a distinction between church culture, the culture of Zion, and so these traditions and folklore that wrap themselves around the church, that attach to the church like diseased barnacles. So another thing to think about is zeal. Talked a little bit about this. Is this an obsessive compulsive disorder? Is this malicious compliance? Or actually doing things the right way? President Benson talked about keeping things in perfect balance. That just don't let things get out of control where you focus on one thing to the extreme of others. The other thing is, part of with the zeal is that sometimes we equate emotional attachment with having a testimony. So you get really energized after conference, and then you slowly lose steam as you're banging up against reality and past habits. Losing steam versus being steadfast and immovable. Notice the difference. What was Christ's zeal like? What was Christ's culture like? What was his zeal like? And let me conclude with seership. How does having a seer at the head of our church differ from other faiths or other organizations, other service organizations, NGOs that help people out? Is this all about a social gospel, feeding the poor and housing people, but they still remain in their sins? Do you need seers? Do you understand why you need to have a seer? Why you don't need, it's not just a prophet and a revelator, but you need a seer, which is something more important. This ability to look at the past and see hidden things that's associated with seership. Are you following a living seer or a dead seer? If you're having issues using the correct name of the church, is it because you're following a dead prophet? Lastly, think about this. Christ is a seer. And what does it mean that Christ is a seer? And when we have a seer witness of Christ, what does that also mean? Because Christ, that's the point.